She was not his wife. But in Hollywood, everyone knew her name. Marion Davies was the young blonde actress beside William Randolph Hearst, the married newspaper king powerful enough to build careers, bury enemies, frighten studios, and make an entire industry watch its mouth. Stars came to his castle. Studio men wanted his favor. Politicians took his calls. Newspapers carried his voice across America. And Marion stood near the center of it all, not as Mrs. Hearst, as the mistress. That was the word Hollywood remembered. Not actress, not comedian, not silent film star. Mistress. The word followed her into rooms before she entered them. It sat beside her name in gossip, in memory, in every story about Hearst's money, Hearst's parties, Hearst's castle, and Hearst's power. Then, in 1941, one of the greatest movies ever made turned that whisper into something almost impossible to erase. The film was Citizen Kane. On screen, the woman was not named Marion Davies. She was Susan Alexander Kane, a blonde performer, a second woman, a figure pushed toward fame by a powerful man who needed the world to applaud what he loved. Audiences watched, critics remembered. Hollywood understood the shadow. Charles Foster Kane looked enough like Hearst for people to talk, and Susan Alexander looked close enough to Marion for the damage to last. That was the cruel part. A rumor can fade, a scandal can age. But a masterpiece keeps playing. For decades, people who had never watched Marion Davies in a silent comedy believed they already knew her. They knew the rich man, they knew the castle, they knew the mistress, they knew the blonde woman whose fame had supposedly been bought. But the record is harder. Marion Davies was not a talentless woman dragged into Hollywood by a tycoon. She was quick, she was funny, she had timing. She understood the camera before the public understood her, and that is why her story is more disturbing than a simple affair. Because Marion Davies was not destroyed by one scandal. She was buried under two machines. Hearst's publicity machine made her too visible. Hollywood's memory machine made her visible in the wrong way. So the question is not only, was Marion Davies Hollywood's most scandalous mistress? The deeper question is this: how did a gifted actress become remembered as a rich man's mistake? To answer that, we cannot begin with the castle. We have to begin before Hearst owned the room. Before the label, before the myth, before Hollywood decided what Marion Davies was allowed to be. We have to begin with a girl from Brooklyn who learned how to make people look at her, before a powerful man made looking at her dangerous. Before she became Marion Davies, she was Marion Cecilia Duras. Brooklyn. No castle, no newspaper empire, no marble pool above the California coast. Just a girl from a family that was close to performance, ambition, and the rough machinery of early show business. Her sisters entered entertainment before her. They used the name Davies. Marion followed. That detail matters because the woman later dismissed as a manufactured star did not begin as a rich man's invention. She began on stage, in chorus lines, in costumes, under lights that did not forgive hesitation. A chorus girl had to be noticed fast or vanish behind every other face. She had to move cleanly, smile on cue, hold the audience for half a second longer than the girl beside her. That was training, not luxury, not romance, training. Marion learned speed before she learned stardom. She learned how to enter a scene, how to turn her face at the right moment, how to be pretty without becoming frozen, how to be ridiculous without losing charm. That would become her gift. But in the audience, another kind of attention was forming. William Randolph Hearst saw her. He was not a young man with a crush. He was a married publishing giant, a man with newspapers, magazines, political reach, money, and the frightening ability to make a name appear everywhere at once. When Hearst noticed Marion, the story changed. Not because she suddenly became talented. The talent was already there. The danger was visibility. A normal actress could fight for reviews, posters, roles, and public attention. Hearst could make the world look. That sounds like a gift. It was also the beginning of the trap. Because when a powerful man lifts a young woman into the light, people stop asking what she can do. They ask what he bought. That question would follow Marion longer than any review. If she succeeded, Hearst explained it. If she failed, Hearst exposed it. If newspapers praised her, people remembered whose newspapers they were. If she appeared on posters, people wondered who had paid for the space. Marion Davies had entered show business as a performer. But once Hearst entered her life, she became evidence. Evidence of his desire. evidence of his power, evidence of Hollywood's hypocrisy. And evidence is a terrible thing for an actress to become, because an actress needs the audience to watch the performance. Marion's audience kept watching the man behind it. That was the first theft. Before Citizen Kane. Before Simeon became legend. Before Hollywood made her a permanent mistress in public memory. The theft began when Marion's own work became harder to see than Hearst's hand reaching toward it. William Randolph Hearst did not support Marion Davies quietly. Nothing about Hearst was quiet. His newspapers could praise, punish, promote, or humiliate. His money could open doors. His anger could close them. His name could change the temperature of a room before he entered it. And when he attached that power to Marion, her career became impossible to judge cleanly. Hearst helped build Cosmopolitan Pictures into a vehicle for her films. He backed her, promoted her, protected her, pushed her into the kind of visibility most actresses would have killed for. But every layer of support became another layer of suspicion. A studio contract was no longer just a contract. A role was no longer just a role. A review was no longer just a review. Everything seemed to arrive with Hearst's shadow attached. That was the machinery of her scandal. It was not only that Hearst was married, that was enough for gossip, but the deeper scandal was power. A married man with a media empire did not simply love a young actress in private. He made that love public through posters, newspapers, production money, and social access. He surrounded her so completely that the public began to see the surround instead of the woman. Marion was trapped inside a strange kind of privilege. She had more promotion than most actresses, and less credibility because of it. That is a cruel bargain. Hollywood was full of male power. Studio heads shaped careers every day. Powerful men chose who was filmed, who was protected, who was discarded, and who was allowed to become a star. But Marion's case was too visible. Hearst was not just another man in Hollywood. He was an empire from outside Hollywood looking in, buying space, shaping publicity, and making everyone nervous. So Marion became the easiest target. People could not always attack Hearst directly. They could attack the woman beside him. That is how the word mistress worked. It made a complicated structure simple. Instead of talking about money, media, gender, studio politics, and public hypocrisy, people could point at Marion and reduce the whole machine to one label: mistress. The label did not ask if she could act. It did not ask if she worked. It did not ask if the camera liked her. It only asked who she belonged to. And once the public believes a woman belongs to a powerful man, it becomes difficult for her to own anything else, even her own talent. That was Marion's problem. Hearst could buy production. He could buy publicity. He could buy rooms, parties, costumes, sets, and attention. But he could not buy timing. And Marion Davies had timing. The scandal could explain the money around her. It could not explain what happened when the camera caught her moving. Marion Davies was beautiful enough to be underestimated. That was one of the traps. Hollywood knew what to do with a pretty woman: light her, dress her, pose her, sell her. But comedy asks for something more dangerous. A comic actress has to damage the pose. She has to let the face move. She has to risk looking foolish. She has to break glamour without losing the audience. Marion could do that. In silent comedy, timing was everything. There was no dialogue to rescue a weak reaction, no voice to explain a joke, no long speech to cover a dead moment. The body had to speak. The eyes had to shift. The expression had to land at exactly the right second. Marion understood that. In The Patsy, she could turn embarrassment into rhythm. In Show People, she could mock Hollywood while standing inside its machinery. She could imitate stars, puncture vanity, and still remain charming enough for the audience to follow her. That is not the work of a doll. That is craft. And this is where the old story begins to crack. If Marion Davies had truly been nothing but Hearst's decoration, the films would be dead on arrival. The camera would expose her. Comedy would expose her faster. But the screen shows a woman with control. Fast control. Light control. The kind of control that looks easy only when it is working. That was Marion's strongest territory. Not the heavy prestige image Hearst sometimes wanted for her. Not the grand costume roles that made her look expensive. Comedy. Parody. Movement. Release. Ironically, the man who adored her may have misunderstood the best part of her gift. Hearst wanted her elevated. He wanted dignity around her. He wanted the world to treat her like a major star. But Marion's power was not in being treated like a monument. Her power was in escaping the monument. She was best when she could move quickly, mock the room, and let the audience see that she knew how ridiculous fame could be. That made her more modern than the myth allowed. But Hearst's protection kept making the frame heavier. The more expensive the frame became, the more critics looked for his money. The more Marion worked, the more people asked whether she had earned the work. The better she performed, the more the scandal stood beside the screen and demanded attention. So the tragedy of Marion Davies is not that she had no talent. It is that her talent needed air. And Hearst's love, with all its money and force, kept taking up the oxygen. Then came the castle, San Simeon. Hearst Castle, a palace built high above the California coast, filled with old ceilings, carved doors, tapestries, statues, pools, terraces, and objects pulled from Europe into an American fantasy. To outsiders, it looked impossible. To Hollywood, it became a private capital. Stars climbed the hill, studio men arrived, writers came, politicians came, comedians came. People who might judge Marion in public still accepted Hearst's invitations in private. They ate at his table, they watched his films, they drank in his rooms, they walked through the luxury. And Marion Davies was there, not as his wife, as hostess. That role gave her power. Guests knew she mattered. She could soften a room. She could make the palace feel less like a museum and more like a party. She could charm people who might otherwise have felt they were standing inside Hearst's ego made of stone. But power without title is unstable. Everyone knew her place, and everyone knew the limit of it. Hearst's wife was still Hearst's wife. Marion could preside over dinners, welcome celebrities, and become the warmth inside the castle. But she could not become the official woman of the house in the way society recognized. That contradiction made her fascinating. It also made her vulnerable. Because Hollywood loves access, then punishes the woman who provides it. The same people who enjoyed San Simeon could whisper about Marion after leaving. The same industry that benefited from Hearst's attention could reduce her to a scandal. The same guests who laughed under his roof could help preserve the word that damaged her most. Mistress. At San Simeon, that word became architecture. The castle did not hide the affair. It staged it. Every room seemed to say Hearst could build anything. But he could not build Marion the one thing that would have changed the way society named her: legitimacy. That was the cruelty of the Hilltop Palace. It made her look powerful and trapped at the same time. Central, but unofficial. Loved, but exposed. Protected, but judged. And while the parties made her more visible, another story was waiting to make her darker. A yacht. A dead producer. And a rumor Hollywood never stopped enjoying. In November 1924, film producer Thomas Ince died after a weekend connected to Hearst's yacht. The official cause was heart failure. That should have ended the story. It did not. Hollywood has never liked an ordinary explanation when power, secrecy, and a dead man appear in the same frame. The whispers began. Some said there had been a shooting. Some said jealousy. Some pulled Charlie Chaplin into the story. Some placed Marion Davies near the center of the rumor. The details changed depending on who told it. That matters. Changing details are not proof. They are often the shape of gossip. But gossip does not need proof to harm a woman already marked by scandal. It only needs her name close enough to the room. Marion's name was close enough. A yacht, a tycoon, a mistress, a producer dead, a private Hollywood weekend that suddenly looked like a sealed door. The ingredients were too tempting. The official record could say heart failure. The public imagination could still build something darker. And once that imagination attached itself to Marion, it added another stain. She was no longer only the woman beside Hearst. She was part of old Hollywood folklore. The dangerous party, the hidden truth, the powerful man, the beautiful woman, the thing everyone supposedly knew but no one could prove. That is the kind of story that damages legacy because it never has to stand trial. It only has to survive as a whisper. For Marion, the Ince rumors did what scandal always did to her. They pulled attention away from the work, away from the films, away from the comic timing, away from the career she had actually built. Once again, she was placed beside Hearst's world instead of her own. Hearst's yacht, Hearst's guests, Hearst's secrecy, Hearst's rumor, Her name kept being attached to objects that belonged to him, and every object made the label harder to remove. This is why the Thomas Ince story must be handled carefully. It should not be turned into a certainty. The official cause was heart failure. The rest belongs to rumor, retelling, and Hollywood's appetite for a secret. But rumor can still shape memory. And for Marion Davies, memory was already becoming the real battlefield, because even if the yacht story remained unproven, the damage did not need proof. It only needed repetition. By the late 1920s, Marion Davies had the kind of screen evidence that should have protected her. She was not just famous, she was funny. The Patsy and Show people gave viewers a Marion that the Mistress label could not explain. She was not stiff, not empty, not a woman waiting for a rich man to make her visible. She moved as if she understood the joke before everyone else. But Hollywood changed the rules. Sound arrived. The silent era began to collapse. Voices entered the theater. Careers that had seemed permanent suddenly became fragile. Some stars could not cross the line. Some voices did not match the faces audiences had loved. Some rhythms died when dialogue arrived. Marion did not disappear overnight. She made sound films. She continued working. But the industry around her had shifted, and the old problem became heavier. Hearst still wanted to protect her. He still wanted her seen as important. He still wanted the world to admire what he saw. But protection can suffocate a performer, especially a comic performer. Comedy needs danger. A woman has to risk embarrassment. She has to fall, lose control, look foolish, break the pretty surface. But Hearst had spent years trying to make Marion look grand, valued, defended, and untouchable. Untouchable is good for a statue. It is bad for comedy. So Marion entered the sound era with two burdens: a changing industry, and a public image too controlled by a man who loved her. The audience did not simply ask whether she could adapt. It asked whether Hearst was still forcing the answer. That question poisoned everything. A normal actress could stumble and be judged on the stumble. Marion stumbled under a spotlight owned by someone else. If a role worked, Hearst's influence explained it. If it failed, critics could say the truth had finally appeared. That is an impossible test. No performer can win when both success and failure are used against her. And still, Marion stayed in the public eye. Still smiled. Still appeared. Still carried herself through an industry that had made her both privileged and suspect. That contradiction is the heart of her career. She had advantages most actresses did not. And those advantages became weapons used to dismiss her. She was too supported to be trusted, too visible to be free, too attached to Hearst to be watched alone. By the time Hollywood was ready to remember her, it would not remember the sound transition, the comic gift, or the work. It would remember a fictional woman in a movie Marion did not make. In 1941, Citizen Kane arrived like a verdict. It was not a documentary. It was not a clean biography. Its characters were built from pieces of American power, ego, loneliness, media, money, and myth. But audiences did what audiences always do. They looked for the real people inside the fiction. They saw Hearst and Charles Foster Kane. Then they looked for Marion Davies, and they found Susan Alexander Kane. A blonde performer, a second woman, a person pushed into the spotlight by a man whose power made her humiliation larger. The association stuck. That was the disaster. Not because Susan and Marion were the same woman. They were not. Not because a film can be reduced to gossip. It cannot. The disaster was that popular memory does not always care about nuance. It likes shortcuts. Hearst became Kane. Marion became Susan. And once that shortcut entered the culture, it became stronger than correction. That is the unique cruelty of being misremembered by a masterpiece. If a bad movie distorts you, history may forget the movie. If a great movie distorts you, the distortion keeps breathing. For Marion, Citizen Kane did not create the Mistress label. The label was already there. The film gave the label a permanent shape. A woman without real talent. A woman crushed by a man's ambition. A woman whose fame existed because he demanded it. That version was easier to remember than the real one. The real Marion was more complicated, funny, skilled, overpromoted, misjudged, privileged, trapped, capable, damaged by the very protection that helped her rise. But complexity does not travel as fast as a myth. Over time, Marion's films became less familiar. Susan Alexander remained available. The fictional shadow stood in front of the real woman. and the shadow had better distribution. That is how cinema can injure reality. A character can walk out of a story and steal the face of someone who never agreed to play her. Marion reportedly did not build her life around publicly fighting the film, but she did not need to fight it for the damage to exist. Hollywood understood the implication. The audience understood enough to whisper. And the misunderstanding became durable. The woman who had once made fun of Hollywood's vanity was now trapped inside Hollywood's most famous accusation against vanity. That was the second machine, not Hearst's publicity machine, Hollywood's memory machine, and it was even harder to escape. Hearst died in 1951. By then, the world Marion had known was already fading. The castle life had thinned, the great parties were over, the studio system had changed, the public that once watched silent stars had moved on. For Marion, Hearst's death was not simple freedom. It was the collapse of the structure that had defined her for more than 30 years. That structure had given her luxury, it had given her protection, it had given her films, visibility, parties, rooms, and access. It had also given her a label she could never fully remove. And when Hearst was gone, the label remained. That is the cruel grammar of her later life. People still introduced her through him. Hearst's mistress, Hearst's actress, Hearst's companion, Hearst's Marion. The possessive did not die when he did. It stayed attached to her name. That may be one of the quietest injuries in the story. After decades beside a powerful man, the world does not suddenly hand a woman back to herself. It keeps using the same shortcut. Marion continued living. She married after Hearst's death. She gave money. She appeared in public at times. She aged through a Hollywood that no longer belonged to her generation. But the old image kept winning. Not because her films had vanished completely, because the scandal was easier to carry. A viewer had to seek out Marion's screen work. No one had to seek out the mistress label. It was already waiting. And then came another problem. The later public image of Marion Davies was not only tied to Hearst, it was tied to Citizen Kane. That meant even people who wanted to understand her often approached her through the wrong door. They began with Hearst, or Kane, or the castle, or the yacht rumor, or the gossip. The actress came afterward. Sometimes she barely came at all. That is not how a career should be remembered. But that is how scandal edits memory. It does not erase every fact. It rearranges them. It puts the affair first, the film second, the woman third. By the end of Marion's life, the wrong version of her had become easier to repeat than the right one. She had been alive, funny, generous, flawed, privileged, and underestimated. But public memory had a simpler file ready, mistress. And once history files a woman under that word, everything else has to fight its way out. The mistake is not that people remember Marion Davies as William Randolph Hearst's lover. She was. The mistake is that they stopped there. They saw the rich man and thought they understood the woman beside him. They saw the castle and assumed it explained her. They saw the scandal and forgot the screen. They saw Citizen Kane and allowed a fictional shadow to stand in for a real career. But the evidence points somewhere else. Marion Davies was not simply Hollywood's most scandalous mistress. She was one of Hollywood's most misremembered women. Her tragedy was not that Hearst loved her. Her tragedy was that Hearst loved her with too much power attached. Power large enough to promote her. Power large enough to protect her. Power large enough to make every success suspicious. Power large enough to make every room she entered feel as if someone else had opened the door. That kind of power does not only lift a woman, it can bury her under the weight of being lifted. And then Citizen Kane came along and made the burial last. A masterpiece became a prison. The film that studied the loneliness of power helped trap a real woman inside another man's myth. That is the cold irony of Marion Davies' legacy. She lived in scandal, yes. She benefited from Hearst's money, yes. She stood in a painful position beside a married man, yes. A serious story should not pretend otherwise, but complication is not emptiness. Scandal is not the same as truth. And a mistress is not automatically a woman without talent, labor, humor, or a private self. Go back now and look at Marion Davies again. Not as Susan Alexander Kane, not as the blonde woman at the edge of Hearst's legend, not as a punchline from a masterpiece. Look at the screen. The face moves quickly. The timing lands. The glamour cracks into comedy. The actress is there before the myth closes around her. That is the image worth keeping. Not the castle, not the yacht, not the whispered word that followed her through history. A woman moving fast inside a frame. A performer making Hollywood laugh at itself. A career hidden beneath a love affair. And a name that deserved more than the label history gave it.